The first thing Nessa Vale noticed when she walked into Ward 9 was that someone had nailed the windows shut. Not boarded them, nailed them. 6-inch industrial fasteners driven through the aluminum frames and into the composite wall studs, the head still bright with fresh tooling marks. She counted 8 nails per window, 4 windows along the east wall, and the precision of the work told her it hadn't been done in haste. Someone had stood here with a nail gun and methodically sealed every source of natural light, every possible view of the sky, every opening through which a child might see something other than the interior of this building. The ward supervisor, a heavy-set man named Jarek Thane, stood behind her in the doorway with his arms crossed. He had the look of a man who had been asked to explain himself, and had decided in advance that no explanation was necessary. "Containment protocol," he said. "They climb." Nessa turned to look at him. She was 43 years old, lean, gray-streaked dark hair pulled back in a plain tie, and she had been a colonial librarian for 19 years, 12 of them in frontier postings, where the nearest bookshelf was whatever she could build from salvaged crating material. She had run literacy programs in refugee settlements, cataloged oral histories from species that had no written language, and once spent 4 months teaching a mining crew on Hadron Station how to read because the emergency manuals were text-only, and 2 men had already died pressing the wrong buttons. But she had never seen nailed windows in a children's ward. "They climb," she repeated. "The Tessavari, the small ones, they get up on the sills and try to open the latches. We had one get a panel loose 3 weeks ago. Maintenance had to pull her off the exterior wall at 14 meters. After that, Director Ulseth ordered the windows sealed." Nessa looked at the windows again. The nails had been driven from the inside, which meant the children had watched it happen. "Where is Director Ulseth now?" "Off-site, quarterly review with the directorate. She left the intake briefing for you." Thane held out a data tablet. "Your assignment is the literacy assessment. The directorate wants baseline cognitive metrics on all 42 residents before the next funding cycle. You have 6 weeks. Nessa took the tablet without looking at it. "I'd like to see the children first." Thane's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a warning but lived in the same neighborhood. "Ms. Vale, the Tessavari are not what you're used to. They don't respond well to new adults. The previous literacy assessor lasted 4 days. The one before that lasted 2. Director Ulseth has a specific protocol for." "I'd like to see the children first," Nessa said again, and walked past him into the ward. Ward 9 of the Kelleth Colonial Orphan Facility occupied the east wing of a repurposed freight depot on the outskirts of Variant City. The depot had been converted 8 years ago when the first wave of displaced Tessavari children began arriving, pulled from derelict ships, abandoned at transit stations, recovered from failed colonial settlements where their families had died or vanished. The conversion had been done on a government budget, which meant the walls were bare composite, the lighting was industrial fluorescent, and the floors were poured resin that had already begun to crack in the high-traffic areas. It looked like what it was, a warehouse with beds. The common room was at the center of the ward. Nessa stopped in the doorway and took it in. 42 children. She had read the number in the assignment brief, but the number hadn't prepared her for the room. They were everywhere, sitting on the floor, perched on the edges of metal frame cots, crouched on top of a low storage cabinet pushed against the far wall. Their ages ranged from very small to early adolescent, and their skin colors spanned a palette that Nessa's eye cataloged automatically. Ice blue, pale lavender, ash gray, soft mint, one child near the back with skin the color of desert sand. All of them had the pointed ears and the oversized eyes wide, luminous, tracking her from across the room with the particular stillness of creatures who had learned to assess threats before they moved. None of them were speaking. That was the first thing that registered. 42 children in a room, and the silence was absolute. Not the restless quiet of children who had been told to be still, but something deeper, a learned silence, practiced and maintained, the kind that came from understanding that sound drew attention and attention drew consequences. Nessa had seen that silence before. In the Hadron camps, in the transit shelters on the outer reach, in every place where children had been stored instead of raised. It was the silence of children who had stopped expecting anyone to listen. She stepped into the room. Every pair of eyes tracked her movement, 42 gazes, each one measuring, each one asking the same question that children in places like this always asked. Are you the kind of adult who hurts, or the kind who leaves? Nessa crossed to the center of the room, pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat down. She placed her satchel on the floor beside her, opened it, and took out a book. It was a real book, physical paper, cloth binding, printed text. She had brought it from her own collection, a volume of illustrated folk tales from the Librarian oral tradition. The cover was soft blue linen, the pages thick and cream-colored, the illustrations hand-painted in ink and watercolor, old enough that the spine had been rebound twice. She opened it to the first page, held it so the nearest children could see the illustration, a watercolor of a small figure standing in a field of tall grass, looking up at a sky full of birds, and began to read aloud. In the time before the roads were built, when the rivers still remembered how to talk, a child walked out of the forest and into the village square, carrying nothing but a stone with a hole in it and a question nobody knew how to answer. Nobody moved, but the silence changed. It shifted from defensive to something else, something Nessa could feel in the room, like a change in air pressure. The nearest child, a small girl with ice blue skin and silver-white hair, had turned her whole body toward the book. Her enormous eyes were fixed on the watercolor, and her pupils were expanding in a slow, rhythmic pulse that Nessa had read about in the xenobiology briefing, the Tessavari attention response. Maximum pupil dilation meant maximum focus. Nessa kept reading. She read for 40 minutes. She did not stop to explain, did not pause to check comprehension, did not ask questions. She simply read, page by page, letting the words and the illustrations carry a listener somewhere else. By the time she reached the end of the first tale, 7 children had moved closer. Not dramatically, Tessavari children did not rush, but in the incremental way of small creatures testing the safety of a new space. The ice blue girl was now close enough that Nessa could see the fine pattern of darker blue markings along her jawline, like the veins of a leaf. Nessa closed the book. The ice blue girl made a sound, small, barely more than a breath shaped into a rising tone. It took Nessa a moment to recognize it, because she had been told the Tessavari children in Ward 9 did not speak. The sound was a question, a single rising note that meant, in any language, more. "Tomorrow," Nessa said, "I'll bring a different one tomorrow." She picked up her satchel and walked out. In the corridor, Thane was waiting with an expression that had added confusion to its repertoire. "They don't do that," he said. "Move towards someone not on the first day." "I read to them," Nessa said. She spent the next 3 days doing exactly that. Each morning she arrived with her satchel, sat in the same chair, and read aloud from a different book. She chose stories with rhythm, with repetition, with illustrations that carried emotion in color and line. No textbooks. No assessment materials, just stories. On the second day, 12 children gathered close. On the third, 19. By the fourth day, the ice blue girl was already sitting in front of her chair, waiting. Nessa had learned her name by then, not from the facility records which listed the children by intake number, but from the girl herself. On the third day after the reading, the girl had pointed to herself and said a word. "Tessa." "Tessa," Nessa said on the fourth morning, holding up a volume of star navigation myths. "This one has maps." Tessa's pupils dilated. She reached out with one fine-boned hand, the extra joint giving her fingers a graceful articulation that made every gesture look like calligraphy, and touched the cover. "Ma PS," she said. It was the first time any child in Ward 9 had repeated a colonial standard word. Nessa did not react. She did not praise, did not exclaim, did not make the moment into a performance. She simply opened the book and began to read, and when she reached a page with a hand-drawn chart of coastal currents, she pointed to the illustration and said, "Map," and Tessa said, "Map," and the word traveled between them like a small, quiet bridge being built one plank at a time. By the end of the fourth day, Tessa was repeating one word in every 3 river, wind, mountain, star, each arriving with the Tessavari rising finish. The consonants softened into something almost musical. On the 5th day, a second child spoke, a small boy with mint-green skin who said star, so quietly that only Tessa heard him. Tessa turned, repeated the word back, and reached out and touched his hand, the first physical contact between any 2 children that Nessa had witnessed in the ward. That evening, Nessa wrote a request for 30 books, not tablets, not screens, physical books, paper and binding and ink. She attached a note, for children who have been taught that silence is safer than sound. They need something they can hold. The library's collections officer approved the request in 12 hours. The crate arrived the following morning, and when Nessa carried it into the common room, every child turned to look. Inside were 30 volumes, folk tales, illustrated natural histories, poetry collections, a Tessavari cultural compendium that the library had acquired from a xenoanthropology department and never catalogued, star charts with painted constellations, a picture dictionary in 4 colonial languages. She placed them in a row on the floor and stepped back. Nobody moved. The children watched the books the way they watched everything new, calculating whether this offering was real or another thing that would be taken away. Nessa sat in her chair, picked up the first book and began to read. Within an hour, 3 children had picked up books of their own. They held them, turned them over, pressed the pages to their faces and breathed in the smell of paper and ink. One child, a small boy with ashen-gray skin and copper-colored hair, opened the picture dictionary and stared at the first illustration for 15 minutes without blinking, his pupils in full dilation. When Nessa looked at him, she recognized the expression. She had worn it herself once as a child in a settlement library on the outer reach. Wonder, the specific wonder of a mind discovering that the world is larger than the room it has been locked in. That was the day Jarek Thane pulled her aside. "Director Ulseth called," he said. "She wants a progress report on the cognitive assessments. You've been here 6 days and you haven't administered a single test. The tests require baseline communication. The children aren't communicating yet. I'm building the foundation. By reading them stories." "By reading them stories, yes." Thane looked at her the way she had been looked at before by administrators, by bureaucrats, by every institutional gatekeeper who had decided that efficiency was more important than the thing efficiency was supposed to serve. "Ms. Vale, the Directorate funding review is in 5 weeks. If the cognitive assessments aren't complete by then, the ward's operational budget gets cut. If the budget gets cut, the children get transferred to the Resettlement Bureau's secondary processing stream." "Do you know what that means?" "I know what it means. It means they get dispersed, split up, sent to 6 different facilities across 4 colonial zones. The older ones get pushed into vocational placement. The younger ones," he stopped. "The younger ones disappear into the system," Nessa finished. "I know how the system works, Mr. Thane. I've been inside it for 19 years. The assessments will be ready. In 5 weeks. In 5 weeks." Thane left. Nessa went back to the common room and picked up the Tessavari Cultural Compendium. She opened it to a page of Tessavari script, dense, flowing characters moving in vertical columns, each stroke carrying tonal information in its curvature. A tonal writing system, designed for a species that communicated as much through pitch and rhythm as through consonants and vowels. She held the page up and looked at Tessa. Tessa's eyes went wide. Not the measured dilation of the attention response, a sharp, sudden expansion, her pupils flooding dark, her ears swiveling forward and locking. She made a sound that was not a word, not a question, a short cry that brought 6 other children to their feet. Tessa crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps, reached for the book and stopped. Her hand hovered over the page, trembling. She looked up at Nessa with an expression that held recognition, disbelief, and something that lived in the space between grief and hunger. "It's yours," Nessa said. "You can touch it." Tessa touched the page. Her fingertips traced the first column of script, and as she traced it, she began to sing. The sound filled the room. It was not melody in any human sense, it was a tonal pattern, rising and falling in intervals that followed the curves of the written characters, each stroke mapped to a specific pitch and duration. Tessa was reading in a language she had not heard spoken since whatever catastrophe had separated her from her family and her world, reading in a script that her fingers knew even if her conscious memory had buried it, reading with her voice because Tessavari's script was never meant to be silent. Their writing was their music, their books were their songs. Around the room, children were rising. A boy with mint-green skin sat down beside Tessa and began to hum not the same melody, but a harmonic line that wove around her voice. Then a girl with lavender skin joined, and another, until 7 children were seated around the open book, their voices rising and falling in a pattern that Nessa could feel in her sternum. They were reading together, singing the text back into existence, rebuilding a language that someone had tried to silence by giving them nothing to read. Nessa understood then what the nailed windows and the silent wards and the numbered intake files had been designed to do, not just to contain the children, to erase them. Without books, without script, without the written word, the Tessavari children had no way to access the deepest layer of their own identity. Their silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was amputation. She found Thane in the corridor. "I need every Tessavari text the colonial library system has, and I need the nails out of those windows. The windows are a safety. The windows are a cage. The children climb because climbing is a Tessavari developmental behavior tied to their vestibular system. Sealing the windows hasn't stopped it, it's just made them climb on furniture. Take the nails out. Install safety mesh. But those windows open by end of day, or I file a habitability complaint with the Colonial Child Welfare Board." Thane looked at her for a long time. "I'll talk to maintenance." "Talk fast." The nails came out by evening. When the windows opened and sunlight fell across the common room floor for the first time in 3 weeks, Tessa climbed to the nearest sill with the liquid grace of a child whose body was designed for vertical surfaces and pressed her face against the safety mesh. She stayed there for 20 minutes, looking at the sky. 2 smaller children climbed up beside her, their blue and lavender hands gripping the mesh, their ears tilted forward as if listening to the wind. The next morning, she arrived to find that the children had rearranged the common room overnight. The metal frame cots that had been lined up in institutional rows were now pushed to the walls, opening up a clear space in the center of the room. 3 of the younger children were sitting in the middle of it, the picture dictionary open between them, taking turns pointing to illustrations and looking at each other with expressions of intense concentration. They were trying to teach each other, without Nessa, without any adult telling them it was permitted. Thane noticed it during his morning rounds. He stood in the doorway watching, and then he looked at Nessa with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something that might have been the first stirring of complicity. "If Ulseth asks about the furniture," he said, "I'll tell her maintenance did it for a floor inspection." It was the smallest gesture of alliance imaginable, but it was the first crack in the wall of institutional indifference that surrounded Ward 9. Over the next 2 weeks, she built something that wasn't in any directorate protocol. She called it the Reading Circle. Every morning she set out books, a growing collection, now augmented by 7 Tessavari texts the Colonial Library had located through an intersystem catalog search, and 3 more that a xenoanthropology professor at Variant University named Dr. Eshin Lore had hand-delivered. Every morning she read aloud, and the children drew closer, stayed longer, and made more sound. Tessa had become the fulcrum. She had taken to the Tessavari texts with a ferocity that Nessa found both exhilarating and heartbreaking, sitting for hours with the cultural compendium open in her lap, her voice reproducing the tonal patterns with increasing precision. And she had begun to teach, in the way that older children in every species teach younger ones. By making the activity look so compelling that the small ones crawled over and demanded to be included. By the end of the second week, 28 of the 42 children were participating. They had learned over 200 words of colonial standard from the stories Nessa read aloud, and they had recovered something far more important, their own voice. The tonal patterns echoed through the ward at all hours, children reading to each other, singing the script in pairs and small groups. There were holdouts. 14 children still sat at the edges, watching but not joining. The most withdrawn was a boy Nessa had started thinking of as Kale, a small child with ashen-gray skin and copper hair who sat in the far corner every day, his back against the wall, his enormous amber eyes tracking everything but his voice producing nothing. Facility records listed him as intake 2291, arrived 11 months ago, recovered from a derelict cargo vessel where he had been found alone in a sealed maintenance crawlspace. The rescue team noted he had not made any sound during extraction, during medical assessment, or during transport. 11 months of silence. The facility psychologist's file described him as profoundly non-responsive. The file was 3 paragraphs long. Nobody had written anything about him since. On the 15th day, Nessa brought a book to Kale's corner. Not a Tessavari text. She had tried that on the 12th day, and he had pressed himself against the wall so hard the composite creaked, recoiling from the sound of tonal script the way someone recoils from a wound being touched. This time she brought the picture dictionary, set it on the floor 3 paces away from him, opened to a drawing of a tree with the word tree underneath, and went back to the circle without looking at him. 40 minutes later, the dictionary was in his lap. His fingertip was resting on the illustration. She left it with him overnight. In the morning it was tucked under his pillow. Nessa brought him a second book the next day, a third the day after. By the end of the 3rd week, Kale had 5 books arranged against the wall beside his cot. He had not joined the circle, had not spoken aloud, but he was reading, in his own way, in his own time, at the pace of a child who had learned that trust was the most dangerous thing you could offer an adult. Nessa let him be. Some children needed a door to walk through, others needed a window left open. On the 18th day, the first blow from outside landed. Tessa came and stood in front of Nessa's chair, not sat, stood and spoke in colonial standard, 1 word at a time, with the gravity of a child communicating something enormous. Before ship we sing, all sing, big sing, she held her hands wide, song, many song. Many, she pointed at the books, the wall characters, her own throat, the other children. All together, 1, sound, big sound, gone now. A library, Nessa said. Tessa's ears flattened. It wasn't a building. It was something that lived in voices rather than walls, a repository carried in the layered tonal singing of an entire community, each voice holding 1 thread, the threads weaving into a tapestry of knowledge no single individual could contain alone. Everyone know, peace, Tessa said. 1 person, small piece, all persons, all piece, big, knowing. A distributed oral library, a living archive that existed only in the chorus of a gathered community. When the community was shattered, the library died with it. Each child carried a fragment, but without the other voices, the fragments were isolated, like single pages torn from a book and scattered across a continent. That's what you've been building, Nessa said. The circle, you're not just reading, you're trying to put the library back together. Small library, Tessa said. Broken but some peace. That night, Nessa sat with what Tessa had told her and understood the stakes in a way she hadn't before. This was about a civilization's memory, stored in the voices of its children, and whether those voices would be allowed to sing or be ground to silence in the machinery of institutional processing. She added 3 pages to her field notes and didn't sleep until well past midnight. But the clock was ticking, and the directorate did not wait for children to be ready. The second blow landed at the start of the 3rd week. A ward attendant named Das Young, new to the facility, assigned to the overnight shift, filed an incident report. During his rounds at 0200, he had found 4 children awake and making noise. They had been sitting in a circle on the floor with the Tessavari compendium open between them, singing tonal patterns in the dark. Das had confiscated the book, citing after-hours quiet regulations, and placed it in the supervisor's office. The children had not resisted, but one of them, Tessa, had tracked Das with her eyes in a way that he described in the incident report as unsettling. Nessa found the report on Thane's desk the next morning, along with a note from Ulseth. All cultural materials to be secured in the supervisor's office between 20:00 and 07:00. No exceptions. When Nessa entered the common room that morning, she could feel the damage. The children were quieter. Not silent, the circle had built too much momentum for that, but muted, cautious, as if someone had turned the volume down. Tessa was sitting in her usual spot, but her hands were empty, and her expression was the blank, careful mask that Nessa had seen on the first day. The compendium was locked in Thane's office. Nessa went to Thane. "Give me the book back." "I can't," Ulseth's order. "A child was reading at 2 in the morning. That's not an incident, that's a miracle." Thane rubbed his face. For the first time, Nessa saw something other than institutional compliance in his expression. "Ms. Vale, I don't disagree, but Ulseth is my superior, and the overnight quiet policy is in the facility manual. If I override her..." "Then don't override her. Just unlock the office door at 06:55 instead of 0700. I'll be here to collect the materials myself." Something passed across Thane's face, the quiet calculation of a man deciding how much trouble he was willing to absorb. 6:55, he said. It wasn't a victory. It was a negotiation, the kind that people who worked inside systems learned to conduct with the precision of diplomats. Nessa took what she could get and moved on. But the overnight lockdown changed something in the ward's ecology. The children had learned again that adults could take things away. The tonal singing during daytime hours continued, but the children now gathered the books together at the end of each session and placed them in a neat stack near the door, as if making them easier to confiscate, as if practicing for the loss. Tessa stopped leaving the compendium on her cot at night. Instead, she sat with it during every waking hour, reading and rereading, her voice running through the tonal patterns with an urgency that hadn't been there before. She was memorizing, committing the script to memory so that if the book was taken again, when it was taken again, the words would still live somewhere they couldn't be confiscated. A child shouldn't have to memorize her own language like a prisoner memorizing an escape route, but Tessa did, and the younger children watched her do it and began to memorize too. The results were accumulating faster than Nessa had dared hope. She documented everything: field notes every evening, detailed observations of language acquisition, social development, the children's emerging hierarchy of peer teaching. She noted that 2 children, a pair of siblings with sandy gold skin and honey-colored eyes, had begun composing new tonal sequences that didn't correspond to any text in the collection, improvising language in real time, building words that had never existed before. She also noted that Das had filed 2 more incident reports. One documented a child drawing tonal characters on the floor with a wet fingertip at 23:00. The other documented the sound of humming from 3 cots after lights out. Both recommended enhanced behavioral controls. The pattern was clear. Each report was individually minor. Together, they formed a paper trail, and paper trails in institutional systems had only one destination. On the 21st day, Nessa made 2 decisions. First, begin running the formal cognitive assessments alongside the circle, embedding test metrics into story-based activities so the children wouldn't know they were being evaluated. Second, she stayed up until 2 in the morning composing an 11-page research brief on Tessavari tonal cognition. She sent it to Dr. Lore and to a journalist she had known in the Hadron camps, a woman named Sira Venn who now wrote for the Colonial Review. To Sira, she wrote, "I need you to look into Section 41 of the Facility Governance Code. Find out whether it's ever been used before and on whom. I think someone is going to use it here." The third week ground forward. Assessments in the mornings disguised as games, as counting exercises, as call-and-response reading sessions that simultaneously measured vocabulary acquisition and sequential reasoning, and the reading circle in the afternoons. 4 hours of sleep a night. The circle expanded to 33 children. Tessa was teaching a group of 8 the principles of tonal composition, showing them how the script's curves mapped to specific pitch intervals. 2 older children had started helping Nessa with the younger ones, translating her colonial standard instructions into Tessavari tonal patterns. The ward was louder than it had ever been, and the noise complaints from adjacent wards were landing on Thane's desk daily. Das filed a 4th report chalk dust on the common room floor after hours, classified as property damage to facility surfaces. Nessa wrote a 1-paragraph rebuttal noting that chalk dust was removable with a damp cloth and that the floor was already cracked resin with a maintenance backlog of 14 months. Thane read it, placed Das's report in a drawer, and closed the drawer. A nurse from the adjacent ward asked whether the singing could be kept to a moderate level. Nessa looked at the 33 children whose voices were filling the room with the sound of a language being rebuilt from fragments and said, "I'll see what I can do." She did nothing. The singing continued. A formal noise complaint appeared in the facility log the next morning. Nessa was tracking the incoming threats with the precision of a combat officer mapping artillery positions. The incident reports, the noise complaints, the clinical flag from the facility psychologist who had described the tonal singing as a potential self-stimulatory fixation without ever visiting the ward to observe it. Each one a shell landing closer to the target. The silence from the directorate ended at the beginning of the 4th week. Nessa was reading from a dual-text Tessavari star navigation manuscript when the door opened and Director Ulseth walked in gray suit, gray hair, gray expression. Behind her, Thane, a man in a directorate uniform and a woman with a leather briefcase. The children went silent, instantly, 42 statues. Tessa's hands pressed flat on the pages, as if she could protect the words with her palms. They stepped into the corridor. Ulseth closed the door behind them, and the sound it made was final in a way that Nessa did not miss. "The cognitive assessments," Ulseth said. "You were contracted to complete baseline evaluations. As of this morning, the directorate has received none. I've completed 18. The remainder are in progress. I can have all 42 filed by end of next week. You have 10 days. The funding review is in 10 days. This is not negotiable." Ulseth paused. "Additionally, the reading circle is not part of the approved program. The Tessavari cultural materials have not been vetted through the directorate's content review process. The window modifications were made without my authorization, and Supervisor Thane reports that noise levels are disrupting adjacent wards. The noise is children learning their own language. The noise is outside operational guidelines." Ulseth held up her tablet. 3 incident reports, a clinical flag on the tonal singing as a potential self-stimulatory fixation, a formal noise complaint. 3 incident reports, a clinical flag, a noise complaint, each one individually minor, together a paper trail with only one destination. The directorate man stepped forward. "Ms. Vale, I'm Inspector Haldren, Compliance Division. The unauthorized curriculum modifications, the material procurement outside standard channels, the structural changes, together they constitute a pattern of noncompliance that the division takes seriously." Nessa looked at Haldren. He had the eyes of a man who had never sat in a room full of silent children and wondered why they were quiet. "Inspector, I'd invite you to sit in the common room for 1 hour. Watch what those children are doing, then tell me about noncompliance." "The invitation is noted." Haldren adjusted his cuffs. "Until the content review is complete, the Tesavari cultural materials are to be removed from the ward and held in administrative storage. I have a temporary impound order signed by the Directorate General under Section 41 of the Facility Governance Code." The briefcase woman produced the document. 2 pages, stamped and countersigned. The stamps were fresh. The signature at the bottom was the Directorate General's, someone 3 levels above Ulseth, which meant this had been escalated, prepared, and delivered with the choreographed precision of an operation planned while Nessa was sitting on the floor reading folk tales. "Those materials belong to the colonial library system," Nessa said, keeping her voice level. "They're on interlibrary loan under my professional credential. You can't confiscate library materials without a judicial order." "Section 41 addresses that," the briefcase woman said. "Library materials housed in a directorate facility are subject to content review while on site. The review process takes 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks, longer than the funding deadline. By the time the review was complete, the children would be dispersed, the circle dissolved, the materials returned to an empty ward. The mechanism was elegant in its brutality. Take the tools, wait for the results to collapse, then point to the collapsed results as evidence the program never worked. I'll need an hour to organize the materials for transfer." Ulseth nodded. 1 hour. They left. Nessa stood in the corridor for a full minute, running the problem. Then she went inside. The children were exactly where she had left them, silent, still. Tessa's eyes were on Nessa, and in them the question, "They're taking them, aren't they?" Nessa sat down, took out blank paper and colored chalk. "Tessa, I need you to teach the younger ones as many tonal characters as you can in the next hour, not from the books, from memory." Something shifted in Tessa's expression, not hope, but something harder, something that looked like a child who had decided to fight. She took the chalk and began to draw. Within 10 minutes, 6 children were gathered around Tessa learning to draw and sing the tonal script on blank paper. Within 20, 12. The sound rose, not the rich chorus of the full circle, but something rawer, more urgent, children trying to memorize a language before someone took the textbook away. Nessa, meanwhile, was working the gap. She stacked the 40 library books for collection. Then she took out the 3 books from her own personal collection, the illustrated folk tales, the star navigation myths, and a poetry anthology she had carried since her first frontier posting. Not library property, hers. The impound order didn't cover personal possessions. She placed her 3 books in the center of the circle. Then she went to Cale's corner. The boy was pressed against the wall, 5 books clutched to his chest, his amber eyes enormous and fixed on the door. "Cale, those 5 books are library property. I have to give them back. But I'm going to get you more, I promise." His arms tightened. Then slowly, he pulled out the picture dictionary, the first book she had given him, and held it out. His lips moved, no sound, but she could read the word tree. She took the dictionary. She watched Cale arrange his remaining 4 books against the wall, touch each spine once, and fold his arms. He was letting go, not because he wanted to, but because he had learned that holding on too tightly only made it hurt more when they took it. Nessa carried the stacks to the corridor, loaded them into the directorate courier's transit case, signed the receipt, and watched 40 volumes disappear down the hallway. Then she went back inside, sat in her chair, and opened the blue linen folktale volume. "Where were we?" she said. The personal book stayed. 3 volumes in a room that had held 40, and the paper and chalk stayed, and the characters Tessa drew from memory stayed, pinned to the walls, growing daily. They couldn't impound a memory. They couldn't file a content review on a voice. That night, Nessa went home and made her calls. Siraven had already been digging. Section 41 had been invoked 3 times in the history of the colonial system. All 3 times, it had been used to remove cultural materials from wards housing non-human minors. All 3 times, the wards had been defunded and closed within 60 days of the impound. In each case, the children had been dispersed into the secondary processing stream, and no follow-up reports on their outcomes had ever been filed. "It's a kill switch," Sira said. "They use it to shut down wards that are getting attention. The impound creates a compliance file. The compliance file justifies the defunding. The defunding disperses the kids. No kids, no ward, no problem. And nobody ever checks what happened to the children after." "Can you publish that?" "I can if you give me the documentation. The impound order, the incident reports, whatever you've got. I'll have it for you in 48 hours, along with 42 cognitive assessments that will make the directorate's compliance case look like what it is." Nessa spent the next 8 days in a state of focused intensity that she would later recognize as the civilian equivalent of combat. The first morning after the impound, the children saw the empty shelves and went silent. For 10 minutes, Ward 9 sounded exactly like the first day. Nessa placed her 3 books and the hand-drawn characters on the floor. "Same time, same place, we still have words." Tessa moved first. She picked up the chalk, walked to the wall, and drew a character Nessa hadn't seen before, larger, taking up a full sheet. She sang the tone, lower, deeper, a humming note that resonated in the floor. "What does it mean?" Nessa asked. "Begin again," Tessa said. By the end of the first day, Tessa had drawn 17 new characters from memory and taught each one to at least 3 children. By the end of the 3rd day, the wall mural had doubled in size. By the 5th day, the children were producing their own teaching materials, pairs of older children writing character lists on paper, and passing them to younger ones the way teachers pass worksheets, except these worksheets were handmade, and the curriculum was an entire culture being reconstructed from the memories of its youngest survivors. Nessa administered the remaining cognitive assessments alongside all of this, every one of them, all 42 children, in the standard format with standard scoring. She turned the assessments into reading exercises, embedded the test metrics in story-based activities, scored pattern recognition through the 3 remaining illustrated books, and spatial reasoning through the tonal script characters that now covered the walls in an expanding mural of recovered language. The children helped. Once Tessa understood what the assessments were, for once Nessa explained, in simple words, that the numbers on the tests would determine whether the children stayed together or were separated, the circle reorganized itself around the work. Older children partnered with younger ones. The pair of siblings with sandy gold skin ran a counting exercise based on memorized star charts, inventing a call-and-response game that the smallest children adored, and that, incidentally, tested every mathematical cognition metric on the directorate's standard assessment form. On the 3rd day after the impound, Nessa received a message from the directorate's Human Resources Office, a formal notice of contract review, citing concerns about professional conduct and adherence to program guidelines. Designed to do exactly one thing: make Nessa understand that she could be removed from Ward 9 before the funding decision was made. She read the notice, folded it, placed it in her satchel, and walked into the common room. She read the children a folk tale about a bird that sang so persistently that even the mountain moved out of its way. When the story ended, Tessa said one word in colonial standard. North. What about it? Bird no north, bird always no north, no matter what, always. Nessa looked at her. Yes, she said, some creatures are built that way. Tessa nodded, picked up her chalk, and went back to drawing tonal characters on the wall. Even Kale helped. On the 6th day, he appeared at the edge of the circle, not in it, but closer than he had ever been. His remaining book was open in his lap, and he was whispering colonial standard labels to a tiny girl with ice blue skin. He was teaching her to read. The boy who had not spoken aloud in 5 weeks was teaching another child. On the 7th day, Kale spoke. Nessa was across the room when she heard it, small, rough with disuse, barely louder than breathing. She turned. Kale was pointing at a picture of a river. River, he said, river. The girl repeated it. Kale pointed to mountains. Mountain. His amber eyes held the page with an intensity that made the words sound like defiance. Then he looked up and found Nessa watching. His face contracted into the defensive blankness of the first day. But it didn't hold. Something else surfaced, not trust, not yet. Something more fragile and harder to name. An acknowledgement that she had left the window open, and he had climbed through it in his own time. Nessa held his gaze for 1 second, nodded once, turned back to the spatial reasoning group. Said nothing about it for the rest of the day. Some things didn't need to be made into moments. That evening in her field notes she wrote, Kale spoke today. River, mountain. He taught them to another child. She wrote it in the same steady hand she used for everything, and if the pen paused twice in the middle of the second sentence, the notes didn't show it. On the 8th day, Kale joined the circle. He sat at the edge, his back still close to the wall, his books in his lap. But he was inside the circle instead of outside it, and when Tessa began the morning tonal reading, his lips moved along with the pattern. No sound, but movement, and the children around him shifted without being asked to make room. On the 9th day, the last major holdout fell. A girl with lavender skin, one of the 14 who had never touched a book, never joined, stood up from her cot, crossed the room, and sat down next to Kale. She looked at his book, at the illustrations, at the words beneath them. Kale tilted the book toward her without being asked, the way someone does when they understand something about being invited in, because someone once did it for them. 35 of 42, the holdouts were falling. The numbers Nessa produced were devastating to the directorate's position, and devastating in what they revealed about what the system had been doing to these children. 34 of 42 children showed cognitive development scores above the colonial baseline for their estimated age range. Above baseline. Not for their species. There was no species-specific baseline, because nobody had ever bothered to establish one, but above the universal colonial baseline for sentient minors. The children who had been classified as non-verbal, non-responsive, developmentally delayed, the children who had been filed under intake numbers and stored in a warehouse with nailed windows, were outperforming the developmental norms that the directorate used to measure its own colonial-born human wards. The remaining 8 children, the most recent arrivals, in the facility less than 6 months, scored a baseline, not below it. Not a single child in Ward 9 was developmentally delayed. They had been silenced, not damaged. Given the chance to speak, they spoke. Given the chance to read, they read. Given the chance to sing, they sang the walls down. Nessa compiled the results into a report that was 47 pages long and included an executive summary that said, in its opening line, the Tessavari children of Ward 9 are not delayed. They were silenced. She attached Sierra Ven's finding about Section 41's history. She attached Dr. Lohr's statement on the cognitive significance of tonal script to Tessavari neural development. She attached her own field notes, all 32 days of them, documenting every word learned, every voice recovered, every child who had moved from silence to sound. She filed the report with the Directorate, the Colonial Child Welfare Board, the Variant City Library Board of Trustees, and the Colonial Review's newsroom on the same morning. Then she walked into Ward 9 and began the reading circle as if it were any other day. The Colonial Review published Sira Ven's investigation 2 days later. The headline ran, Section 41, the statute used to silence non-human children. The article detailed the 3 previous invocations, the pattern of defunding that followed, and the current impound order against Ward 9's literacy materials. It quoted Nessa's assessment data. It quoted Dr. Lohr. It did not quote Director Ulseth, who had declined to comment. The Colonial Child Welfare Board dispatched an observer the same day. A woman named Arden Kesh, gray-haired, quiet, carrying no data tablet and no clipboard. She sat in the back of the common room for 4 hours without speaking, watching the reading circle, watching Tessa teach, watching the children read from hand-drawn characters, and 3 battered personal books in a room where the shelves were empty, but the walls were covered in script. At the end of the 4 hours, she stood, walked to Nessa's chair and said, "Ms. Vale, how many books do these children need?" "All of them," Nessa said. Kesh nodded. "I'll make some calls." The funding review came on the 10th day. Ulseth returned with Inspector Haldren, the briefcase woman, and 4 additional people, Arden Kesh, Dr. Lohr, Sira Ven, and a library board trustee who had driven across the city at dawn. The room was transformed. Every surface covered with paper tonal characters in colored chalk, star charts from memory, illustrations of folk tales, vocabulary lists, mathematical patterns. The children's work covered the walls from floor to head height, a mural of recovered language that had outgrown every attempt to confine it. Tessa was teaching, 38 children reading along, voices weaving together in the harmonic structure that no impound order could reach. In the corner, Cale was reading aloud from his last remaining book. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was there, and the tiny ice blue girl was sitting beside him, her hand resting on the page next to his, following the words. And the lavender girl was on his other side, murmuring along. 3 children in a corner, reading together, and every one of them had been classified as non-responsive less than 6 weeks ago. Ulseth watched for 4 minutes. Her data tablet lowered by degrees until it was hanging at her side, its screen forgotten. Haldren watched for 6. The compliance folder in his hand did not open. He had come with a case built of incident reports and regulatory citations, and the case was dissolving in front of him, because the evidence against it was not an argument or a counterfiling but 38 voices singing in a language that nobody in the Directorate had ever bothered to learn. Dr. Lohr sat on the floor with 3 children within 10 minutes and did not get up for 3 hours. He was scribbling notes with one hand and tracing tonal characters with the other, his academic reserve crumbling in real time. Sira Ven took notes. Arden Kesh said nothing, but she was watching with the expression of someone who has found exactly what they came looking for and has already decided what she is going to do about it. The library trustee walked to the empty shelves where the confiscated books had been, ran her hand along the bare surface, and turned to Ulseth with an expression that required no translation. Then Tessa did something nobody had expected. She stopped the reading. The circle fell quiet, not the terrified silence of Ulseth's previous visit, but attentive stillness. She walked to the center and sang. Not a reading, a composition. The Sandy Gold siblings had taught her the principle of invention, that the tonal system wasn't just a record of the past, but a tool for creating what had never existed. Tessa had composed a tonal sequence using the grammar of the old script to carry new content. This room, these children, what had happened here. The silence, the nailed windows, the books arriving, the books being taken, the chalk on the walls, the human who read aloud until the world got larger. The children joined, one by one. The harmonics built, voices weaving into the architecture of Tessavari collective memory, the distributed library rebuilt from fragments, each child holding one thread, the threads woven into something larger than any of them could carry alone. In the corner, Kale closed his book. He had been watching with the stillness that Nessa had learned to read as his form of maximum attention, the same stillness he had shown when he first saw the picture dictionary, the same stillness he had worn for 11 months before his first word broke through. But this time the stillness didn't hold. Something moved in his face, and he opened his mouth, and for the first time, he added his voice to the chorus. It was thin, it wavered, it cracked on the higher tones, but it wove into the harmony with a precision that told Nessa he had been listening to every note every day from his corner, mapping the patterns in silence the way he had mapped the words in his dictionary carefully, thoroughly, alone, until he was ready. 11 months of silence, 5 weeks of watching, and now his voice was part of the library, one more thread in the weave, and the sound it made when it joined the others was the sound of something being completed. Arden Kesh stood very still. Dr. Lore had stopped writing. Sira Ven's pen was frozen. The library trustee was pressing her hand against her mouth. Director Ulseth turned and left the room. She did not close the door behind her. The singing continued for 6 minutes. When it ended, the quiet had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with completeness. A record had been laid down. The children of Ward 9 had told their story in their own language, and the adults who had come to judge them had heard it. The review board's decision arrived 4 days later. It arrived in stages, each one landing like a wall being dismantled brick by brick. The ward's operational budget was not cut. It was increased by 40%. The reading circle was formally incorporated into the facility's educational program as a model curriculum. The impound order under Section 41 was rescinded, and the confiscated materials were returned to the ward the same afternoon Nessa unpacked them herself, placing each book back on the shelves she had built from salvaged crating material. And when Tessa saw the cultural compendium again, she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes and made a sound that was not a word in any language but meant the same thing in all of them. A permanent librarian position was authorized for Ward 9, funded for 3 years, with an expanded materials budget that tripled the previous allocation. Inspector Haldren's compliance review was closed with no findings. Director Ulseth was transferred to an administrative role in a different sector, pending a separate review of her tenure. Supervisor Thane was appointed acting director, and his first official order was to remove the nail gun from the maintenance inventory, and to revise the overnight quiet policy so that reading after hours was no longer classified as a behavioral violation. The Varent City Library Board established a standing collection of Tessavari cultural texts to be housed permanently at the Kelleth facility, under the professional stewardship of the ward librarian. 16 volumes arrived in the first shipment, more than the ward had ever held at one time. The Colonial Review ran the story under the headline, "The Ward That Learned to Sing." By the end of the week, the Directorate General issued a system-wide memorandum suspending Section 41 pending a comprehensive review of its application history. 3 other colonial orphan facilities, housing non-human minors, requested consultations on implementing reading circle programs. Dr. Lore published a preliminary paper on Tessavari distributed memory cognition that was cited 14 times in its first month. Kale received 5 new books from the returned shipment. He arranged them beside his cot with the same meticulous care he had given the originals, touching each spine once before stepping back. But this time his arms didn't fold tight against his chest. This time his hands rested on his knees, and when the tiny ice blue girl toddled over and reached for one of the books, he picked it up and opened it for her, and the word he said, "tree," came out loud enough for the whole room to hear. None of which mattered as much as what happened on the last evening. After the decision was read and the calls were made, and the last of the visitors had gone home, Nessa went back to the ward. It was after hours. Thane raised an eyebrow when he saw her, but he held the door open and stepped aside without a word. Under the revised policy, reading was no longer a violation, and the ward librarian had access at all hours. The common room was dim. Most of the children were in their cots, but Tessa was on the window sill, legs folded beneath her, looking at the sky through the mesh. The window was open, and the night air carried the smell of rain and the distant mineral tang of the canyon beyond the city. Nessa sat in her chair. Tessa. Tessa turned. In the low light, her eyes were huge and silver, the pupils wide and still. She was holding the cultural compendium against her chest, not clutching it the way she had before, when holding on was a form of defense. Holding it the way someone holds something they no longer fear losing. Nessa, Tessa said. Her Tessavari accent softened the consonants, adding the characteristic rising finish. It sounded every time like a question and an answer at the same time. I'm staying, Nessa said. The library is staying, the books are staying, nobody is taking them. Tessa looked at her for a long moment. Then she climbed down from the window sill, crossed the room, and placed the compendium in Nessa's hands. She opened it to a page near the back dense with tonal script in fine, curving characters. Not one of the pages she had been reading and rereading for weeks. A new page, one she had been saving. Ready, Tessa said. You ready? Nessa looked at the page. The script was Tessavari and she couldn't read it. She had never learned the tonal system, had only ever heard the children reproduce it. She had spent 32 days giving them words. She had never asked them for any of theirs. She traced the first character with her fingertip. Show me, she said. Tessa sang the first note. Nessa repeated it badly, her human voice flattening the tonal curve into something blunt and graceless. Tessa smiled. The first time Nessa had seen her smile, a small expression, barely more than a shift in the line of her mouth and a brightening in her eyes, but it changed her whole face. She sang the note again, slower, and Nessa tried again, and this time it was closer, and Tessa nodded and moved to the second character. They sat there in the low light, the book between them, the window open to the night. Two voices, one rising, one uncertain, both persistent, building, plank by plank, a bridge that no one could nail shut. In the corner, Cale's cot creaked. He was sitting up, amber eyes open, watching. His lips moved along with Tessa's tonal pattern, tracing the sounds the way his finger had once traced the word tree, carefully, silently, committing it to the part of himself that no one could take. Tessa saw him. She sang the third character louder, pitching it to Carrie. Come if you want, stay if you'd rather, the door is open. Somewhere in the ward, another child began to hum. Then another. Then three more. The sound rose through the building like warmth through cold stone, filling the spaces between the walls, settling into the cracks in the resin floor, reaching the high windows where the nails had been removed and the sky was visible, and the world, for 42 children who had been taught that silence was safety, was finally, irreversibly, larger than the room. Nessa closed her eyes and listened. It sounded like children reading in the dark because they wanted to. It sounded like voices that had remembered they existed. She opened her eyes. Tessa was watching her, the compendium open between them, her finger resting on the third character, patient, ready. The way a teacher waits for a student who is worth the waiting. Again, Tessa said. Nessa leaned forward, traced the character, and sang.